Formula One's hugely divisive 2026 rules were nearly 6 years in the making, but a series of high-level meetings to discuss changes after just 3 races have now begun. A first meeting between senior technical figures took place on Thursday, April 9th, and discussions will continue between various F1 stakeholders over the rest of April as options to improve the most compromised parts of 2026 are weighed up. The primary focus for F1 is how to stop the most overt and egregious energy management tactics being necessary even on a qualifying lap. But there is disagreement over how much, if anything, needs to be changed about what is happening in the races. F1 still stands by its belief that the racing product in this energy-limited formula, decried by Fernando Alonso as a battery world championship, is not actually bad, and if anything is better because it's sparking more overtakes. But by the time the season resumes in Miami in May, F1 2026 is likely to have a different set of rules governing at least one key competitive part of the race weekend, and as Ferrari boss Fred Vasseur says, whatever is changed will have an impact in some way on the pecking order. It's a pretty remarkable turn of events for a set of rules years in the making to be changed so soon, but it reflects the fact this is not a formula that anyone is particularly happy with. More changes might be necessary this year and certainly will be discussed for the future. Fast-tracking a new engine formula, potentially switching from the V6 hybrid engines to V8s with sustainable fuel is an idea that will not disappear in the background. And that gets to the heart of the problem, the switch to a near 50-50 split between the internal combustion engine and electric power for these rules. That's not changing anytime soon, which means whatever ends up being changed off the back of these crunch April meetings won't remove the millstone that's around F1's neck. So how did it come to this? The often referenced 50-50 split between internal combustion and electric power that F1 has become entirely beholden to with these rules can be traced all the way back to the start of the decade. It first started to be openly referenced by competitors in F1 in 2020, namely Mercedes, but also the FIA, who felt it was a realistic goal to set. But it wasn't just a single slogan that existed in isolation, it was tied intrinsically to a desire to bring new manufacturers on board. There were private internal meetings by the end of 2020, and then in 2021, conversations at CEO level with various engine manufacturers, those already in F1, but also representatives from the Volkswagen Group, including Audi and Porsche, and also Ford. Honda, despite intending to formally withdraw at the end of 2021, was also represented. These various discussions outlined several elements that needed to underpin any future F1 engine formula, with some familiar pillars: cost control, sustainability, and electrification. Critical to the plan was removing the MGU-H. This was an incredible technological novelty of the previous hybrid engine formula that recovered wasted heat energy and worked to spin the turbocharger directly to eliminate lag, but it was very expensive to produce, very complex, and had minimal road relevance. Audi made it very clear that it would not proceed without dropping the MGU-H, as it felt the established manufacturer's mastery of that component was too great a head start for it to overcome. The likes of Mercedes were willing to make this compromise in return for ensuring that new manufacturers didn't get too much assistance with extra dyno time or a bigger cost cap allowance. But to facilitate the loss of the MGU-H and have a bigger electrical component overall, the MGU-K needed to be uprated pretty much threefold to 350 kilowatts of peak power output. In addition, the internal combustion engine power output was brought down to somewhere around 400 kilowatts, thus the sort of 50-50 engine was conceived. This equal split is not actually an equal split, and as a slogan it is also misleading in another important sense. The MGU-K can only be used at its full 350 kilowatts for a very short period of time across a lap. There are many moments where it is working in reverse and the total power output of the engine is massively reduced, so in reality the 50-50 is a peak headline ratio that bears only a partial relationship to what actually happens across a racing lap. And with Audi's desire for harvesting energy from the front axle never gaining traction, F1 was left committed to an engine with an increased electrical power demand from one component, but ultimately the same battery capacity and reduced flexibility on how it could be charged. The first goal for the 2026 regulations was ultimately to attract more manufacturers, and by any measure that has been a success. Audi, unlike Porsche, which ultimately walked away despite prolonged discussions, went through with its desire to enter F1, and others were tempted by the marketing line of F1's new reality. Ford came to the table in collaboration with Red Bull Powertrains, and Honda committed to a U-turn on its plan to withdraw from F1 completely as it decided to build a new engine for 2026 after all. Plus, General Motors has also been enticed to start an engine program that will be ready by 2029, and that has been key to Cadillac being allowed to join the grid this year. That's 3 brand new automotive manufacturers getting involved in some way this decade that would not be there without the rules as they are, plus Honda recommitting. It's important to understand the context for why it mattered. In F1 specifically, Mercedes and Ferrari were definitely continuing into any new engine formula, but Honda was withdrawing while Renault was considering its own future and did eventually discontinue its engine program despite initially signing up for 2026. There was a real risk in which F1 could have had only 2 proper manufacturers signed up, with Red Bull forced to create its own engine division. This was a key factor in why F1 wanted new manufacturers, along with the financial benefits they bring. And while F1's popularity was growing significantly at the start of the 2020s, it still needed the manufacturers more than the manufacturers needed F1, so it had to sell the idea to them. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the automotive world was under great financial pressure, and there was also a massive push for electrification alongside the phasing out of combustion engine cars in various cities and countries around the world. Electrification is still a big part of the narrative, but it has shifted, and being in F1 is now a bigger deal than it was even a few years ago. Were negotiations starting with Audi in 2026 versus 2020, for example, the parameters and the negotiating leverage would be completely different. Of course, there were also political and personal agendas involved. The prospect of bringing in manufacturers was clearly something F1 and the FIA wanted to count as a massive victory for themselves. Of all the manufacturers at the table, Audi clearly had a big hand in these rules being conceived the way they have been. Mattia Binotto, who is now the head of the Audi F1 project, is adamant that Audi never made it a requirement that there had to be a 50-50 split. But Audi's priority was to have high-efficiency engines, sustainable fuel, and a significant electrification component. It also made its opposition to the existing MGU-H very clear. The absence of the MGU-H, ironically, is now partly responsible for a major weakness in Audi's package. Its starts are particularly terrible, presumably because it has the largest turbocharger size of any engine, and without the MGU-H, turbo lag on these 2026 engines is really bad, hence so many teams struggling with consistent launches, and Audis are the worst on the grid. Somewhat supporting the idea that Audi was not specifically part of the 50-50 demand is that Binotto suggests it would not stand in the way of an adjustment to this ratio, so clearly it's not a non-negotiable from Audi's perspective. However, it should also be said that Audi's management has changed completely since it greenlit this F1 program and was part of those initial talks half a decade ago. The VW and Audi top management is entirely different, and Binotto's essentially the 3rd different F1 boss the project's had already. So who knows what Audi really demanded or not? Maybe what it needs has just changed along with the industry, or the people in charge. Regardless of who was responsible for this rule set taking this form, there have been chances to correct it. The concerns about what the 50-50 split would actually produce on track began to surface from inside the process not long after the core framework was agreed. Christian Horner, then Red Bull team principal, was the most prominent and persistent voice of concern. In 2023, he warned that the regulations risked producing bizarre charging techniques and what he described as Frankenstein cars, forced to paper over the cracks. He argued adjusting the ratio between combustion and electrical power, not abandoning the formula, just tuning it even to 65-35 or 60-40, would remove the need for much of the complexity that followed, but that ship had sailed. Among the clearer signs that these problems were understood and considered controllable was the reduction of the charging limit across the lap from 9 megajoules to 8.5 megajoules. This reflected the fact it was already known that the more the cars could harvest, the more extreme the tactics would be. The FIA knew right from 2022 that the 50-50 engine split had challenges and was adamant the worst problems had been mitigated. It either underestimated the challenge or overestimated the work that had been done, and whether that was due to naivety, arrogance or hubris is impossible to know. The worst case scenarios that were predicted may have been mostly avoided, but there are still problems starting these engines, charging these engines and racing these engines. Fiddling around the edges now by adjusting superclipping thresholds, tweaking deployment parameters and softening harvesting rules should address the worst of the problems in qualifying, but how much it helps is subject to what gets agreed in the ongoing meetings. And it will not get to the core of the issue, because that is the 50-50 architecture itself and the way the formula has been imagined. By not addressing the core constraints, F1's been left scrambling to treat the symptoms instead of the cause.